Hello, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first ever webinar of the Small Business Saturday Talk 2024. While you're joining today, I would love to hear where you're from and what the weather's like. For instance, I am in Manchester and it's cloudy and grey, but it is not raining, which is a very good thing. So please do pop that in the chat. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Emma from the Small Business Saturday team, and it is lovely to welcome you today to our webinar where we are talking about the power of storytelling with the wonderful Stacia Keogh, who is going to share all of her insight and knowledge with us. Hello.
Right. Oh, right. Look at where you all are from. I'm in where I call Boringshire in Maidenhead. That's Maidenhead in Berkshire, and it is gray. And but like Emma and I were saying, we have the leaves, and the leaves have their special color. So it's a lot of change and transition. I'm really excited to be here this morning because what better way to kick off Small Business Saturday than with storytelling? Because you're going to be hearing a lot of stories from a lot of people. And I want to sharpen up your ears so that you can do some story listening, because the other half of storytelling is story listening. We're all in the middle of our story right now. Everybody is in the middle of a story right now, right now. And the best way that you can make the next move in a story is to ask a question. It's the question that makes the story move forward. And it's also what will engage your audience. So when I come to this work from being a storyteller, from traditional tongue polished tales. And one of my jobs was as a creative partner in creative partnerships with schools and businesses and that. And one of the things that we used to always start with was a question of inquiry. Not a how question, not a why question, but a what question. And that's one of the most powerful questions you can ask. So we've got some things that we want to do, and it's all about the power of storytelling. Get to the point. So I'm going to get to the point, and I'm going to share some slides with you so we can all keep on track and have some visuals besides uh, my words. Yes, share.
Fabulous. Just while you get set up just there, just some very small housekeeping things from me. We are recording today. You probably all heard that kind of big voice saying this session is recording. So don't worry, we will send a replay to your inbox so you can catch up on anything that you miss. Do pop your Q&A, your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, just next to the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat and obviously Q&A as we go, but just make sure that they're in the Q&A box so we can come to them at the end. So without further ado, I will hand over now because I'm sure you're all raring to listen to what Stacia has to say.
Yeah, so I started out as an actor and I still do acting work, and I am a voice artist and several other things. I work with companies and entrepreneurs to help them pitch and present and tell their story. So I want to tell you what we're going to get going on today. And one of the things that we want to learn is how to craft an engaging story. People talk about storytelling all the time, but they never tell you actually how to do it. And so I want to give you some actual tips, blueprints, actions of how to tell a story. Also, to be clear and concise in your communication, because sometimes stories can get a little woolly, and that's not what they're for. They're to create context, of course, but they're a vehicle to get you from to another place and actually move you through an experience. Also, this experience builds that emotional connection. So you want to engage with people on an emotional level, not to manipulate them, but to find that empathy. And empathy is a shared emotional experience. So as I was saying, I began in the beginning of days, in my university days, I began writing corporate training videos. And this was way back in the day when we were using multimedia instead of video because it was cheaper. And then we would just film it instead of doing a video. So we did corporate training and explainer things. And it was like being a little filmmaker, and I really enjoyed it. I'm a trained actor. I still do acting work and voiceovers in games and audiobooks. And I am a traditional teller of tongue polished tales. And so I've worked with different communities and cultures all over the world. And I've worked with businesses and entrepreneurs helping with pitches and presentations. Now, as a creative partner, Like I said, with schools and businesses and certainly organizations, we go in with a question of inquiry, which was always very rich, which gave us lots of ground to explore and work. Sometimes I'd hang around as an artist in residence. I was a Lambda, which is London Academy of Music and Dramatic Arts. I was a tutor and helped people get ready for their exams. I also sat on their examining panel for 7 years. And as a resting actor, I love the English word resting. In the United States, we just call it "you're out of work." But when I was resting, I temped in and then got jobs in advertising companies and in production houses. So I worked with places like JWT, working on pitches and presentations on some of their global business with Kimberly Clark, Unilever, um, Jaguar, places like that. The really useful group, because even though it's Andrew Lloyd Webber's production company, you actually have to pitch those shows. And the Imagination group, which is they do all sorts of imaginative thing from product launches to events. Kew Gardens, where I ran a group of volunteers in the gardens that operated as explainers. So they would have a table of different artifacts and products. So you could really learn the stories behind the plants and you could learn where those plants came from. So it was a bit of a foray into economic botany. I work with Oriflame, which is a Swedish skincare company. I work with their marketing team, and now I'm working throughout their global organization. Bosch, again, with their marketers, and with City and Guilds with their tech teams to take them from being order takers to trusted advisors. And that's what you want your story to be. You want to become a trusted advisor, not a lecturer, not an order taker, not a report giver. So business stories are purpose told stories. So you want to think about what is the purpose of the story? Why do I need to tell this story today? Who am I telling it to? And what do I want that listener to be after they hear the story? What's going to change for them after they hear the story? How is this story going to change them? What value is it going to bring? So, some of the purposes that you can use your story for is to bond, to actually find your community. Who are my friends? Who are my fellow travelers? Persuade. We hear that a lot, especially in advertising, to get people to do stuff. But it can also be to think a different way, or to see things in a different way, or to behave differently. Envision is to see something you haven't seen before. People want to process, you can give them a different process, and you can inspire them. All these are purposes to help you decide which story to tell. Because there are two sides to every story. There's the teller, and there's the result that you want your story to produce to bond with your community. A good example of that would be REI does that with their stories about adventure, because they don't just want to sell adventure products. They want people to find out why people go on adventures. They want to draw the adventurers to them. Persuasion, maybe you want people to, like I said, think differently, do differently, behave differently. And vision. You want to talk about something that hasn't happened yet. But your audience, they have a purpose for listening to your story. They come to hear and they have a goal as well. They want a new process. They want to find a different way of doing things. Maybe there's a gap in their information, and that gap is really important because that's where the learning drops in. And they're also looking for inspiration too. So you want to find the cross reference about the story that you want to tell for your reason and the story that your audience wants, and so that you have an aligned purpose. And that's where you get that engagement. Now, people talk about a narrative and they think that all stories are narratives. It's true, but not all narratives are stories. Because to have a story, you have to have certain main ingredients and you must be specific. Otherwise, it's just a general mishmash and it doesn't really mean anything. First of all, you need to have an identifiable character, somebody that we can either see as ourselves or that we can see from life. A lot of times in traditional tales, we use a thing called the midrush system for telling a story. So you can tell the same story, but you can tell it from different angles. You could tell it from the main character. Maybe they're the one that's talking. That's that kind of on the nose storytelling. What about telling that story from the onlooker's point of view? That can lead to some incredible observational insights. Or a sentient being. And now that's somebody that's non human. It could be an animal. We have a lot of animal tales. Or it could be an inanimate object. A great example of this is Caldwell Banker in the States. They are a real estate company and they tell a negative story. One of the negative stories that they tell is what happens to the house when you split up, and they told it from the standpoint of the dog, like who gets the dog. And that was an interesting way of looking at that story. You can tell it from non-sentient beings, and these are some things that we can't see: magical creatures, feelings, the weather. Authentic emotion. Now, emotions are not just one thing. They are a trajectory. They ride on a track. One thing leads to another. You're not just angry. You might just be a little annoyed. You might be worried. And then you might get a little really, vexed. And it goes on from there. And then it might change into sadness or something else. So authentic emotions are not stayed one trick ponies. They tend to change. Think of them like the weather. Significant moment, very important, because remember, you are a storyteller, not a plot teller. So you want to go right into that moment. One of the techniques that I use with my clients is we look at different story structures and different way to structure your story, what might serve best. And one of my favorites is in media res, where you drop right into the center of the story. Start in the middle. Like I said, we're all in the middle of our story. So if you start in the middle, then you can open it out. You get people's engagement right away. So, one client that I worked with, she is a yoga teacher now, but she was in the print business. And she tells the story of back in 2012, it was the Olympics. She had just stepped off a curb, was crossing the road, and then this car came around the corner from nowhere. Luckily, she didn't get hit by the car, but she fell to her knees because they ran over her foot, and that's where her story starts. Specific details. In this story, she goes on to say that she was in shock, authentic emotion, and that all these people rushed around her trying to help her. Her foot was blown up like a balloon, and she just couldn't figure out what was going on. All these specific details, even naming things about that street, the look on people's faces, all of these things build out that picture in our mind. The reason storytelling works so well is because we are co creators. As we're telling, our listener is co-creating that story in their mind, and they're bringing their imagination to it and all of their questions about what happens next. Did this happen? The feelings start to develop. That's why when you tell a story, it's really a good idea to tell that little bit and tell that little bit and tell that little bit and allow it to develop in your audience's minds and hearts and bodies, especially if you're telling a lot of sensorial detail. They need a minute to build that picture up in their mind. A story has three acts. The setup. This is the way things are. And that's a really important factor because then you set in place all the elements in your story so people can locate it in time and space. The blow up. Something happens that knocks it off course. Your story starts when life blows up. If you remember back when you were a kid, all those fairy tales, they started with don't. Don't pick up the feather. Don't open the door. Don't step off the path. But if the character didn't do the thing, then there wouldn't be a story. So it always starts with misfortune or fortune or some sort of change. If I boiled story down to three words, I would tell you conflict changes life. So something happens, something frictional happens that makes it impossible to carry on the same way that we've always been. Either there's something missing, or there's something that's been taken away, or something just isn't right. Or maybe there's something bigger out there, and we just need to find out where it is. The change up. This is either the imagined future, this is the way things could be, or it's the new now. What is different now? A great example of a story difference by just changing one step change. I don't know if any of you guys are athletes out there, but in 1968, there was a guy named Fosbury, and he changed the way we do the high jump. And how did he do it? He was a middling high jumper. He was okay. He'd made the Olympic team, but he approached the high jump. Everybody went towards the high jump and they went towards it and then they jumped over it as high as they could. He went towards it and turned around and jumped backwards and went higher than everybody else. With that one step change, that one little difference, he changed the way that everybody does the high jump to this day by going backwards. You have your story, you have your business story, and then you have the client story. And the client story and the business story and your story all kind of come together in that transformative thing, the change. The change. What is it that changes? Something has to change in the story, or it isn't really a story. So you have to have change, that transformation. This is about getting to the point. So many times we have this huge big buildup, or we try to shove more facts in there than the thing can hold, or maybe we just spend a lot of times, just taking that fact and trying to prove it and trying to justify it and trying to make it more than it is. So this is my very basic advice for people that are doing presentations or telling a story or using any of these devices is cut the fat, the fluff, and the fat. What I mean by that is fat is too many facts. Why don't you center on just one question or one statement or one fact? Focus on one thing and then build out from there with a little bit of context, an example, a story, um, some sort of a what happened if you didn't do this, but don't need to fluff it out by justifying it or telling us where you got that or any extraneous information. Cut it down to the bare bones. And the faff is when you just fluff around and faff around and do a lot of just extraneous, whether it's physical noise or loose language that isn't really purposeful. It's a whole nother presentation that I do just on language. So cut the fat, the fluff, and the fat, and just get to the point and tell it straight to start with. Because the key questions that your story needs to answer is this, and story really hinges on question. We hear a lot about, Emma and I were talking before we came on about story brand, and they use one particular style of storytelling, and that is hero quest. But questions are throughout time and what your story should have. It should awaken questions in people, not shut down, not answer. Don't worry, you don't have to have the answers with a story. You just have to open up the question. And that's what makes it really rich. And that's what engages people. In conversation, when you want somebody to join in, you ask a question. So your story should raise a lot of questions for people because it should set them on their own little path of discovery as well. The key questions are, what feeling do you want this thing to create? Do you want to create a feeling of warning, a feeling of motivation? Do you want people to come away from this thing feeling empowered, more knowledgeable? Do you want them to feel a little bit shocked, or do you want them to feel delighted or hilarious, relieved, distraught? How do you want them to feel? Again, who is the character telling the story and who's listening to the story? You can have more than one character in a story. The key event, this is really important. Again, you're a storyteller, not a plot teller. So, and then, and then, and then, and then, and then, and then, you know, go to that moment, tell that moment, and really build it out because that is all we need sometimes. And what changed as a result? That transformative power of story. That's why it's transformative, because something changes. Sometimes it's a thing that you don't expect. Sometimes you don't win. Sometimes you don't get what you ended up for. Sometimes you just learn from the whole experience. So take any story that you have, and this is how you bone it down to the bare basics. Make a little chart for yourself. What happened and why? How did you feel? What changed as a result? That is a basic blueprint that you can use, any story that you have, to just bone it down to its essentials and then find in there what about this story is actually, again, is going to be the cross reference that I can use to speak about a particular message that I want to deliver. Where do we get stories? Look, I mean, there's a thing that we have in storytelling about asking people, where does the 4 points of the compass meet? So I'll ask you, where do you think the 4 points of a compass meet? If you were to have a compass in your hand, which direction would you go? Where do those directions meet? Anybody have an idea? I can't actually see the chat, but Emma will tell me if anybody comes up with an idea there. But the 4 points of that compass meet
One
right.
person said in the middle, in the center.
Perfect, exactly. They meet right at your feet. So always start with yourself. And oops, we'll go back to that. Look for reoccurring themes in your life, things that come up over and over and over and over again. The thing about story is your story never shuts up. So until you start really following on your journey or really answer those, following on the questions, really going to those questions and thinking, let's pick a little bit deeper and wider here. It'll keep coming back at you. People often say, "Oh, I don't know about telling my story because it's very personal. I feel vulnerable." Of course you do. But people don't want to know the drama and trauma and the guts and the all of that. Really, there's only three things people want to know from your story. And that's what experience taught you, what lessons that you wish someone would have told you, and how did you face adversity? How did you keep that little flame burning when everybody was trying to blow it out? Also, you could look at what do you aspire to? This could be a story about what you haven't even done yet. Side trips. I know we talk about pivots all the time, and I certainly do when I look at threshold moments, which are life events or just complete changes in direction. But sometimes a side trip is really good. It's that kind of loop that you took on the side that you didn't expect to, but where you got a little lost, but you might have learned some things too. And adversity, like I said, how you face adversity. Because when a character faces adversity in a story, that's when all the characteristics fall away and a true character emerges. You see that all the time in movies and books and things where they introduce the characters and then something happens, and all of a sudden, the fluffy one actually is the one that has this steely determination. All of a sudden, the one that you thought was really kind of a geek is also the one that knows how to solve all the problems. So it's the characteristics and the character are two different things. This is Diane Watson, who is a financial advisor that I worked with, and she needed to tell stories about finances and wealth planning and all of that. And she thought it was pretty boring. And so I said, but is it? So we looked at a lot of her personal stories, we looked at a lot of her client stories, and we told stories about pension and compounding interest and critical care cover. And what we did was we developed a whole ecosystem of stories because Diane really learned about finance from her mom. And this was back in the day when women didn't really have agency over their own money. And that's why Diane set up She Can Prosper, because one of the things that she was seeing with her clients was too many women that were passengers in the conversation about their finance. But you have to remember that we've only really had agency over our finance for maybe 50 years. So that's why she set up She Can Prosper, to really educate women about financial matters and to empower them to make their own decisions. From all those speeches, she wrote a book because they all came together in a book. And now she's a keynote speaker, and you can get the book, She Can Prosper, and it's wonderful. So, the three most important stories that your business can tell is that value story. Why do clients need you? What's the transformation, the difference, not the product, not the service, but the difference that you make in their life. You could be saving them time. You could be giving them security, peace of mind. Maybe you could be just making their life a much more delightful, luxurious place. Certainly, anybody that sells candles or chocolate out there, you're definitely lighting up somebody's life. So, the origin story. Now, there is a story called the founder story, which is how your business started. And that's a good story to tell. But the origin story is really much more powerful because that's the first story. And that's where your genius started. I mean, I started with storytelling when I was a child. Most of the things I learned really, and I teach to people is when I was a child, is through play. You know, my small world play was off the charts. We used to invent, it's called RPG games and video games now, but we used to invent role playing games. I did all the time. And, you know, we'd be gone all day, you know, on adventures. The purpose story. This is where you align your business with the bigger game. So, for instance, with my business, literacy is super important to me because there are over 7 billion people in the world that cannot read or write a sentence. Two-thirds of them are women. Why is that? If more of us could actually read and write, we could think for ourselves. And this introduces critical thought, which means people are going to be forming better questions. They're going to be questioning things more. They're going to be having much more enlivened and enlightened conversations. And that's why I am really passionate about literacy. And that is really finding your words, words to speak. So, the gap. I talked about it earlier, but these are the turning points in your story. This is where the gap opens up and we don't know. You don't have to know everything in your story, but be bold enough to go to the place where you don't know and see what bubbles up. That gap in your audience's mind, will you surprise them or introduce some curiosity or a new insight or go in a different direction? That is where you can drop in the knowledge because remember that goal that they have is to find a new process or to fill that gap of knowledge that they don't have or to be inspired. So these gaps are super important and that's where the transformation takes place in your audience and in your story. You can plant the seeds of aspiration and build an image of what could be. And this is super important. You know who uses this all the time is definitely holiday makers, financial institutions, because before you go on that trip, before you buy that house, before you decide to make some big life move, you have a think about it. You have a dream of it. You get the idea of it. And then you start planning the steps and looking into it. But you've got to plant the seed of aspiration first. Now, the quickest story that you can tell, because one of the things we want to look at is how you can build emotional connections and how you can make those connections with your audience. The main thing that a story does is it explains things in a really succinct way. It tells you about stuff that you don't already know, or it takes you to a place that you've never been before just by telling you and by using things like metaphor, image. You can challenge your audience using humor, especially if you're telling a negative story, always humor. And that sensory description. You make that gleaming detail and then you gleam it and you gild it all the way through your story. Because metaphor is the spine of a story. So you can tell a quick story all the time just by using metaphor. To describe one thing in terms of another. We do it all the time. Green with envy, over the moon, fighting tooth and nail, giving them the third degree. You can describe abstract terms by using familiar things that we all understand and finding that common ground. So one of the things that is coming up a lot is money. You know, we have millionaires, billionaires, trillionaires. How much money is that actually? I have no idea. But I do know about time. So if you look at 1,000,000 seconds, that's about 11 hours. It's about 11 days, actually. 1,000,000 seconds is 11.6 days. If you had 1,000,000,000 seconds, that is 31.7 years. So from 11 days to 31 years is a huge jump. But if you had a trillion, and we have trillionaires out there, that is 31,688 years. Huge jump. Huge jump. Now that puts money, something that's a little bit abstract, into terms that everybody can understand. You can use metaphor to condense information. So these are little quick stories that you can tell, little quick things that give that story language and that story feel. You can talk about a situation being a can of worms. You can talk about separating the wheat from the chaff. You can talk about it's a pressure cooker in there. But we get these images in our head and they're like mini stories because that's what the brain does. It makes things up so that we have context, so that we can understand things that we don't have understanding of, or we have a quick sort of like shorthand to make sense of things instantly. That's why story works. That's why we use a lot of metaphors because they're mini stories. A story without any facts, by the way, is called a confabulation, and we hear a lot of those. And this is Andrea Newton, and she was an HR consultant, but she wanted to tell stories about more difficult conversations like suicide in the workplace. She talks about menopause. She talks about a lot of things that are really difficult to talk about. She used her own personal story of leaving a very abusive relationship. We never talked about the relationship, but we talked about her journey moving from one stage to another in that from that relationship to where she is now. And we used the object metaphor of shoes. So you can have language metaphors, you can have object metaphors, you can have gesture metaphors, which when you're presenting really engages your audience. So we used shoes. And now Andrea wears these beautiful shoes all the time. She started out wearing orthopedic shoes because she thought she had knee issues, but it was really the weight of this relationship bearing down on her. She went on to describe one level of her journey as being like having flip flops on a slag heap. She talks about sturdy walking boots when she found her dog rescuer friends and, found a community for herself. And now she has a podcast called Really Useful Conversations. She's a keynote speaker and she is a fabulous wearer of shoes. And it's still in her logo or in her LinkedIn logo line. So there's the stories you have, there's the messages that you need to deliver, and you need to find the intersect between them. Find what you can cross reference. You might have a story about somebody with, a terminal illness, and then you need to deliver a message about time. So, learning the value of time and what's really important. I had a client that did that. You might have a story of like coaching your kids' sports team, and maybe they didn't win the big game, but they learned a lot about being a team and about grit and determination. So it's kind of looking at the themes and the stories you have and finding the intersects. What story is your audience telling? It's no good talking to people about stuff that they're not interested in. That's why it's basic for anybody who's presenting to ask themselves, and I think I said this at the beginning, why do I need to tell this story? Why is it important to me and why should they care? And then who needs to hear this? Who am I actually talking to? And finally, how is this going to change their life? I mean, really, how is this going to change their life? You do this with theater, with speeches, with everything. You want people to walk away from that having gained some valuable insight, having gotten something that they didn't have before, having been inspired, or really just thinking new questions, maybe. So here's a good little story pattern for you because we want to know how we can put all of the stuff that happens to us into maybe a little micro story. You can go from a big question, from the big picture to like, what can we do about homelessness? It's a big question. We can't do a lot, but we can. Then put in small, doable steps. You can, as a friend of mine has done, you can start bags of kindness at Christmas time, which is what she did. She made really useful little bags and got people to volunteer their time and to volunteer stuff to put things together for them. You can donate to charity. You can actually, just when you see people on the street, acknowledge them as people and smile. Little doable steps, but it focuses the attention on what can be done. So show something that's a big question, break it down into what's, 2, 3 actual doable small steps that you can make towards it, and focus the attention on what can be done. Again, maybe it's just asking a better question because questions move the conversation forward. Optimize every speaking opportunity. You should be speaking all the time because my mission is getting more people to talk to each other and less people listening to the news because I think should be influencing each other with lived experience because that's the real story. Where are these opportunities to tell your story? Well, they're right there in front of you, just where the 4 points of the compass meet. When you go networking, that social pitch, that story of you, that's not about your resume, your CV, your qualifications. It's about the qualities and skills you possess. Spotlight presentations. If people give you an opportunity, like today, me getting this opportunity to speak to you about what I do, take it. Take it. Don't turn down any speaking opportunities. In fact, that's my clients are mostly really intelligent experts that turn down opportunities to speak because they don't feel like they're expert speakers, but with a little bit of training and some stagecraft, they step into their expertise and they definitely sound like experts and we need to hear from them. Social media lives, go live on LinkedIn. Do it, do it, do it. Maybe do it with a buddy, maybe do it with somebody that already does it. And then you can have somebody interview you, which is sometimes easier than having to do it all by yourself. I do a LinkedIn Live with Steph Walsh, who's an animator. We do it on Fridays at noon. It's called Razzmatazz with Pizzazz. Go look it up. Podcasts. I have a podcast called Finding My Voice. There's a theme here, but you can guest on people's podcasts. And that is a way to tell your story. Interviews, panels, Q&As. These are places to tell your story. It takes a while to get known. It takes 7 hours, 11 interactions, and 4 locations, according to Google when they did their zero moment of truth. This is how long people take before they make a decision to work with you. You're talking about how do we emotionally engage with people? Over time, they learn to trust you. So if you have perhaps 7 hours of material that somebody can go online and stalk, that's a starting point. Maybe there's 11 different times when you showed up in their life, maybe on their feed, maybe at a networking event. Again, this goes to 4 locations, seeing you in different locations. What are your weekends like? Are you a runner? Are you an open water swimmer like me? Are you somebody who does charity work, seeing you in different locations. This builds up a jigsaw picture of who you are. Because by the time somebody decides to work with you, by the time somebody wants to welcome you into their world, they have done some looking into who you are and they know a little bit more about you. This is how all life on earth starts, and this is how you can make a start and start your own storytelling culture with episodic stories. The epic stories are not ones that can be told in one day. They're ones that are told episode after episode after episode over time. And you start with the most magic number of all, which is 0. Start from where you are, start from nothing. I'll tell you a company that does excellent episodic storytelling, and that is Always. They are a company that um, manufactures feminine products. Their key customer are teenage girls and who are starting their menstrual journey. So, how do they serve and add value to a teenage girl's life? Well, they ask the question, what is it that happens with teenage girls? What's the biggest obstacle that they have? Confidence. They lose their voice, they lose their confidence, and so they thought, well, how can we fix this? Let's start with the name calling because that's where it all starts. Like a girl, You do it like a girl. So they've launched their Like a Girl campaign, and they have turned around what like a girl means. And it's some of the most watched adverts on YouTube. People actually go to YouTube and watch adverts because they're informational. They're not just about selling, they're informational, they're inspirational, they're all stories. So my mission is, of course, that you tell your story, share the wisdom of your lived experience, because it's going to change your life. The more you tell your story, the more you start to believe, oh my God, this is me, this is true. And then you can influence yourself as well as others. You can work with me. I do a spotlight program, which is 4-session Kickstarter, Follow Spot, which is monthly support, VIP, like some of my clients that you saw today, and they develop a whole speaker ecosystem, but it all starts with a discovery call. So give me a call. And I'm hoping that you have questions that you want to ask me because that is all I have to say for now.
Hello. Oh, thank you so much. That was such a wonderful session. I really like the story you were telling about. Was it Andrea with the fabulous shoes? I thought that was wonderful. Thank you for that.
She's really moved on, and that's the thing, once you start telling your story, you realize that it's not just one thing. It's not just the same thing over and over again. If you allow it, it will grow, and that is, allow it to open up questions, go in with the question. Rilke talks about that. It's not about the answer. Your story doesn't have to answer anything. It just needs to open up bigger questions.
Fabulous. Thank you. Well, we've got some questions, so I'll dive straight into those. There's one which has just popped up on the chat, which is from Sarah, and she says, "Do you have any tips or lessons learned from your work with the Swedish skincare brand?"
Yes, one of the things that, I learned with them is that they are leaning into, they have so much already right there that they were trying to reinvent the wheel. So we just really broke it back down into, um, the simplest. What is simple? And that's where they're why they're having such a moment now because they're really leaning into the simplicity and the work-life balance that they offer. And so they've changed their messaging to finding your happy place instead of so that it's all about the because they're what they're doing is empowering people to actually start their own business. They're leading in with knowledge, skincare knowledge, and making things simpler. So they really leaned into the simple message. So a lot of what I did with them was just get a template going and step back and hold the space to allow them to find out what they already had right there. So they didn't need to invent anything.
Thank you. Another question which has come through, which is Chris from Teddy Bear Tea Rooms. What a lovely business name. I love that, Chris. How often would you advise us to tell a story?
All the time, like every day. Like, you can have they don't need to be huge. They need to just be little bits. This is where the metaphor comes in. You can start using story language. And so I'm sure that you have a story every day. And not that you have to post every day or anything like that, but we go on socials all the time, like TikTok and Instagram stories, just to snoop what people's lives are going on. So a great way of storytelling, and this goes to posting, is that documentary style. Look at me here. This is what I'm thinking here. This is what I see right now. And this has got me reminded of that. So stories start popping up all the time. There was a Caribbean storyteller who actually wrote a book. It's a beautiful book, and it's called Open Mouth Story Jump Out.
Ah, that sums that up perfectly, doesn't it? Wonderful. Next question. I'm very good at telling my story and engaging with people in person, but I'm not confident recording myself or creating content to engage with my audience on social media. Do you have any tips to overcome this?
Well, a lot of times people, like I said, it doesn't have to be you. It can be observational. It can be a story that you saw. Again, that with that midrush system, it doesn't have to be you, the main character, all the time. There can be other. It can be an observational story. It can be a story that happened to somebody that you know. It can be a story that has happening that you've observed, like in the wider world. You can do it from an onlooker point of view. You can do it from a sentient being, like I said, like the dog telling the story of the breakup and who gets the house. So you don't have to record yourself. You can record, like, the nature around you. You can record an object. Just have a voiceover on that. Or you can, a lot of people don't even use their voice. They have music and then they just have the words.
Totally. So you're thinking things like, for instance, I don't know if there was an object and that reminded you of something, you could then say, oh, look at this. This reminded me of blah, blah, blah. And then that's still telling a story. Is that the kind of thing we should
Yeah.
think?
Yeah, I mean, so for instance, so it just pops into my head is like cup of tea. Doesn't every person drink a cup of tea in this country? 100%.
Yeah.
And so there you are with your cup of tea, but do you have it in a mug or do you have it in a cup or do you have this or do you have that? Okay, you can stir that cup of tea and you can just sit down and say, I'm just going to have a cup of tea with y'all. And you can just make the cup of tea, stir the cup of tea, and you can talk over all you're doing that. And you've told them the story. You don't have to point the camera at your face all the time.
Take it back to basics, keep it simple, as you were saying with the skincare brands.
Super simple, super simple. Like they have a thing in Sweden called fika, and fika is just coffee and cake. But it's a whole. It's like hoogie. It's like a whole. It's an actual thing where people actually stop. They sit down. They have a chat, and they have it over coffee and cake. So the culture sets it up. Come in and have coffee and cake. So when they did their big presentation in London, one of the things that they put in their goodie bag was a bit of Swedish cake. And instead of saying, she said at the end of her talk, instead of having a QR code or anything like that, she said, come and see me for a bit of fika.
Oh,
And
oh,
so people were like, oh, because it's a whole new thing. So, it's just using what they already had. Because the thing is like, you think it's like, oh, this old thing, but nobody else knows about it. It's again, people thinking not everybody knows what you know. If you sit on a mountain, you can't see the mountain. We see you sitting on the mountain, but you can't see it. You see this view out here. So there's a lot of stuff that that's why I want people to talk about their lived experience, because that is wisdom. You are all experts. You are all wise people. You just need to go, hey, I know that thing.
oh, fabulous. Another question. Another question from Teddy Bear Rooms. Sorry if I missed this. How long time-wise should each story last?
Till it's finished. How long is a piece of string? So, you've got your beginning, middle, and end, which is set it up, something happens, and then, what happened as a result of that. It's not a timing thing. It's more like it just needs to play out. So, as a storyteller and as a speaker, you will have 5-minute stories. You will have 10-minute stories. You will have a 10-minute story that you could lengthen out by telling more detail and information into a 20-minute story. Sometimes you will have to do a story. I have stories that are an hour long, or longer. But it just depends on what will the moment bear. So a lot of times for like a social, you want like a 2-minute thing on LinkedIn. When I had a radio show, I used to jump on because I'd had the show all booked in, and then there was a news thing that happened, and I had a couple of minutes. So I was just sitting there waiting for the news to finish, and I jump on LinkedIn and I do a live saying, this is what's going on, this is what's happening, blah, 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 blah. I did it at the same time for the same length every Monday. And then there was a Monday when I did a pre-recorded show, and then I get this pop-up on my email going, Stacia Keogh, you've got like 100 people looking at your LinkedIn account. And I'm like,
Basically
what are you
alive.
doing? And I'm like, oh, they're waiting for me to go live.
Oh, that's amazing.
You establish a pattern, then people start to look for it. Don't you look for that too? People that post all the time and you go and snoop their life, and then all of a sudden they didn't post for a while, and you're going, what happened to them? What's going
That's them.
on?
Yes, exactly. Uh, Another question's come in, which is, would it be a good idea to have an elevator pitch type story that I can kind of reel out at networking events, things like that?
Absolutely, 100%. So, but allow it to evolve. So that's what in the Spotlight program, that's the first thing that we work on, and that's the story of you. And it gives you a template, so you get the do re mi of like how can I pitch myself? How can I tell my story every time I meet somebody? It's you kinda have a template for that, and then you allow it to evolve the more comfortable that you get with it. But yeah, definitely have something, and what the pitch needs to be is a conversation starter. You're not telling everybody everything. Again, too much fat, too much fluff. Just, you want it to be a conversation because the whole idea of a pitch is you're throwing something and you want them to catch it and throw it back. And
Mhm.
so then if you pitch them, then they wanna have more questions, and the social pitch at a networking function, it should, hook somebody into at giving you a call. You always wanna follow up with people or getting that invited pitch where they actually have you in and they have a question of inquiry and they want to go deeper into like maybe how we can collaborate together, how you can work for us, how I we can work for you, things like that. I pitched at an event called Work the Room, and I stood up and I gave my pitch, which was, I want more people telling their stories. You all have a story to tell, therefore you are all my clients. And I went on, and I'm kind of a barnstormer because if that's what I do for a living, I pretty much have to rock the house, or I'm not very good at it. But there was a woman at the end of the table, and we didn't get to meet during the event, but I followed up with everybody, and she came on and did work with me, and then she was just at the last one, and she pitched, and then she could say, "I've worked with," and everyone said, "Oh, your 60 seconds is really good," and she goes, "It's because I've worked with her, and I met her here at this thing." So then people start recommending me. The other thing about storytelling is you want it to be memorable and repeatable. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be clever, it doesn't have to be long, but it's something that people remember, so repeat things and, repeat because repeatable, because it's an oral tradition, right? You tell it, and then they tell 50 people, and then they tell, and they tell, and they tell, and that's how we got all of our stories from, the Silk Road and the spice trade, and, it's from people going around sharing the stories from all over the world.
And when you're telling a story, it's you're not selling to anyone. You're just sharing a little bit of yourself, and that's such a good kind of hack, isn't it, for communicating and connecting with your audience,
It
people
is.
be more meaningful customers, hopefully. In
100%, 100%. I mean, and this power of 3, it's really important. So that's why there's like the three stages to the story. There's like putting, you've noticed I use 3 throughout the thing pretty much, or an uneven number, but 3 is the smallest pattern that the brain can latch onto as a pattern, 1, 2, 3, ready, steady, go. It's like we have it in our, so this is something that is already built in that people can latch onto that makes it memorable.
Mhm. What tips would you give to stand out at a job interview and to differentiate yourself from other candidates who follow standard interview tips?
Well, the thing is they'll ask questions, and one of the things that we do in the Spotlight program, the last thing is about interviews, Q&A, panel speaking. So with interviews, you're interviewing them as well. So have some good questions to ask them. Do your homework so that you can have some questions to ask them. And usually people go in there and they want the job. But, if you go in there and it's like when I with acting work, when I stopped trying to get the job and just went in there and was the best actor and was just booking the room, just booking the room and getting in front of those people and really talking about, again, aligning with that purpose. What's your big purpose? Why is this job, why do you want to be a part of this company? And what do you want this company to do for you?
Mm.
So really that's much more active. Be an active listener. When you're actively listening to them and you're following their language, then you see what's important for them too. And then you repeat what they said and then, make it something into your next remark. So we use a technique called link and build. Link onto what they said and build on it, link onto what they said and lead it to something that is important for you, or link onto something that they said and pivot to something that they haven't picked up on yet.
Maybe something they may not be mentioning, and you want to kind of drill down on why that might be.
What is this all about? You have a lot of churn in your company. What's going on?
Fabulous. I hope that answers your question. Next one is from Tessa Day, and she said, when you talk about being live and speaking as much as possible, what channels do you think are the best to start with for those business owners who have limited time?
Well, I mean, how do you get your clients? Where do your clients come from, and where do you want to be? What do you like to be, Because if you like it, you probably meet people that you like to work with. I like live events because I like the social aspect. I'm a social creature. I like to get, value and bang for the money. You got to know you're in the right room, because is it a place that you feel excited and enlivened in? Do you feel support there? There are rooms that I've walked into and I'm just like, I'm just not feeling it. I just
Yeah.
don't want to be here. I just am not feeling that reciprocal energy because that's what it is. It's you're giving energy out, you're getting energy in. So it needs to be reciprocal. Um, but where can you tell your story quite simply is a lot of people use it on social posts, doing those lives because it's right there in your hand. It's right there accessible to everyone. You have a big audience and that's where when you put that story out there, again, bonding, who are my mates? Who needs to hear this story? They will latch onto it and really ask questions so you can get that engagement going. Make it an open question so it's not yes or no, it's not preachy, that's not what story is, not a lecture, it's not a report. Um, so that they can say yeah me too, or they can say I wonder about that, or what do you mean by that, or that got me thinking. So social media is a great place. LinkedIn is a great place. It's a great platform to use, and then just networking, like I said, and all those suggestions I gave. People also, you can get into the press. You can go, there's a site that's a new one called Press Flow. There's also Light Bulb. And if you have your stories like really succinct in that template that I gave, like action, emotion, outcome, like that, bone down like that, and a journalist wants to know something about that, like menopause, or I've got somebody I work with who's doing mom guilt. She's
Mm.
had triplets. So she knows all about mom guilt and she's really passionate about that. Like Diane with finance, she can talk about that. And then when the journalist says, I need comment on this, or I need a story about that, or I need somebody who knows about this, you can just go ahead and pitch for that and go, here, I've got a story about that. And then you can get into press like that.
And it would probably, I assume it's very helpful having to sometimes write it down to go through. And then sometimes it's easier to see, okay, I can cut this bit out. I can, I don't need that bit or whatever.
Yeah,
So,
you can refocus your story too, like I said, what if you had the same story, but it had a theme of this or a theme of that or different themes, because they're multi-purpose. So you look at them, if you think about any story that you've heard or even your own story and you revisit it another time, it's different. It's the same
mm,
story, but it's different. You can't step into the same river twice. So it's going to be different for depending on your audience. It's going to be different depending on how you're feeling that day, what experience has taught you again and again. So it evolves a story. So don't think you have to tell the same story, same
mm,
way. And
mm.
that's the thing when you look at some of these speakers and certainly story brand and stuff like that, they're telling the same story again and again and again. And it's like, it's very It's not what a story's supposed to be, otherwise, they wouldn't be hanging around, we wouldn't still be telling. I mean, you can still listen to Cinderella, and you can hear a different story all the time, you know? For me, the story that I hear, or when I was a kid and we used to play the game, um, my mom had the cleanest kitchen floor ever because it was the injustice of the stepsisters that was the most important thing about that story. So we used to play this elaborate servant and master game with it all the time. But it's different all the time. It changes. You're telling that story for princes, stepmothers, Wicked
Mhm.
Stepsisters. They're all out there.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm very sorry. We have run out of time. So I'm sorry if we didn't quite get to your questions, but I want to say a massive thank you to everyone for coming and also to Stacia for such a wonderful webinar today. We will be here, Small Business Saturday team, Monday to Friday at 11 a.m. So do come and join some other webinars. If you attend 10, we will send you a little festive Christmas treat. So make sure you book onto those 10 sessions for that. Thank you also to BT Digital Skills for yet again sponsoring the tour and making this possible. Again, thank you all for coming, taking time out of your very, very busy day, and I hope to see you all tomorrow.